second question for the week. This is from Outside Zone Pod. That's at Outside Zone Pod. Is it a coincidence that Bryce Young and Anthony Richardson have looked better after getting benched, or is there something to glean here? Yeah, I think there are a couple things to glean. Outside Zone. I think the first thing is that we need to be careful about making sweeping judgments, myself included, about quarterbacks within the first 3 or 4 years of their career. We're seeing it with Baker Mayfield, with Sam Darnold, with Geno Smith, how, even really good quarterbacks can be kind of prisoners of their own circumstances early in their career. And it's very uncommon that you see a quarterback of that age overcome bad circumstances. Now let's look at Bryce Young's circumstances. He comes in, he's drafted by Frank Reich. He's drafted by general manager Scott Fitterer, who, is on his second coach. Midway through his rookie year, his coach gets fired. His GM gets fired at the end of his rookie year. So now you've flipped not only the offensive system going into year 2, you flipped the coaching staff. You've got obviously the normal attrition and turnover on the roster. Bryce Young's already been through a lot as a young player. Anthony Richardson has not been through all of that. But here's a guy who was sort of dealing, I think, early in his career with that Trey Lance dichotomy. And I'm not saying he's going to become Trey Lance, but that Trey Lance dichotomy where he wasn't at points good enough for a coach to say, this is our roster's best option, but he needed the reps because he just hadn't played enough. Like Trey Lance, like the problem Trey Lance had in San Francisco was Trey Lance needed to play more, but he's playing for a contender. And Kyle Shanahan couldn't sacrifice single plays, series, games to the development of a quarterback when he had a roster full of players that were ready to contend in the here and the now. So where Trey Lance just needed to play and just needed to see more stuff and just needed to build up the library in his head of things that he had seen, the Niners weren't in a position to afford him that. The Colts ostensibly were, but like it gets to a point where it's like, can you still sell him to the roster if there's clearly a better option on the roster? And that's what Joe Flacco gave them earlier this year. So the coaching staff had to work through that, where Anthony Richardson had to earn his way back onto the field. And same thing goes for Bryce Young. I think for Dave Canales, as positive a person he is that, when you're in your first year, you have to create some accountability. And, you create that accountability in your program. And it's, you can't have one standard for the quarterback and another standard for everybody else. So for different reasons, the benchings happen this year. I think it's an accountability thing in Carolina. And I think in Indianapolis, there's a little bit more of we need to give our veterans the best possible answer at the position. And right now it's not Anthony Richardson. And then I think when you go through that, then it becomes like, okay, like, can these guys earn their way back in the field? And both of them have. And so, I think where, we look at the normal trajectory, and again, I'm guilty of this. And you say to yourself, like, okay, like this is generally when a guy loses his job, like as a young first round pick, who the team has invested a lot in, there's no going back. And generally when you give the guy the job the first time, you're not taking it back from him. Maybe the rules of engagement have changed a little bit on that. And I'm open to the idea of that, because I do think that, the challenge in developing quarterbacks is different than it was 15 or 20 years ago. So I think, what the benchings did was, I think in Bryce Young's case, the benching, showed the locker room that Dave Canales was going to hold people accountable. I think in Indianapolis, the benching showed the veterans in that locker room that Shane Steichen was going to do everything he could to give them the best answer at the most important position on the field. And then in the end, both those guys wind up earning their way back on the field and get some benefit out of it. So I don't know if Anthony Richardson or Bryce Young are going to be the quarterbacks of the Colts and the Panthers in 10 years. But what I do know is it does seem like they've taken some good from a tough circumstance, and maybe getting knocked down a little bit helped accelerate some things as far as their development goes.